This week's theme is poems about places, and it's really impossible to talk about the romantic sense of place and landscape without understanding the crucial terms, the sublime, the beautiful, and the picturesque. And this all starts in the 18th century with Edmund Burke. He writes the philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful in 1757. But this is a text that continued to maintain a heavy influence on aesthetic theory well into the 19th century. So this will give you some sense of where some of the poetic theories of Romanticism come from, and will certainly show that Romanticism was not a complete break from the 18th century philosophies that preceded it, but owed some important elements to ideas that were already quite well accepted. Burke's theory is in some ways an attempt to answer the age-old question, why does tragedy give us pleasure? Why do we enjoy observing representations of human suffering that would shock and appall us if we saw them in real life? And Burke's answer to this question comes from a link through the physiological causes of pleasure in the human animal. That's how do we experience aesthetic pleasure? He tries to trace this back to physiology, and he says basically we want to embrace pleasure and avoid pain. Those are basically the two natural impulses that all human beings have. So we have social inclinations towards pleasure and impulses of self-preservation that keep us from pain and death. These emotions revolve around the emotions that revolve around the avoidance of pain, Burke reasons, must be stronger than those revolving around pleasure, since he claims we feel pain more intensely than we feel pleasure. And this is maybe a contentious proposition, something to think about. Do we necessarily agree that pain is more intense than pleasure? But it is an important point for Burke and for the Romantics later, because it's the basis of his argument that the sublime is fundamentally a higher artistic principle than the beautiful. So let's get into these two categories. First of all, the beautiful. For Burke, the social and sexual inclinations towards pleasure connect to the beautiful. That beautiful objects attract us to them with such qualities as smallness, smoothness, and harmony. And in using modern words, we might use words like cute or pretty to describe what Burke means by the beautiful. In still other terms, the beautiful is in art what appeals to our senses and therefore is easily incorporated into our mental conception of the world. We can see, we can appreciate, we can note every detail in something that we find beautiful. On the other hand, we have the sublime. And what is sublime in art or in nature is whatever disrupts our rational understanding of the world by producing a sense of terror and uncertainty. So in this, as in all other respects, it's the opposite of the beautiful. The sublime exceeds the limits of our consciousness and makes us aware of something that is greater than ourselves. So the sublime art is that which signals an excess in the power of the artist to create it and in the power of the observer or the reader to comprehend it. The sublime is necessarily obscure, in the same way that a horror movie is only scary when you don't know what's out there. As soon as you see the monster or the killer, it stops being scary. So the sublime then is characterized by qualities such as danger, obscurity, largeness, and disharmony. And as the beginning of your excerpt in your textbook points out, it creates the effects of astonishment and fear. It challenges our rational apprehension of the world. So the sublime for Burke is everything that makes us aware of our own mortality, our own insignificance in the world, any implicit threat. But at the same time, Burke emphasizes it's a threat that has to be far enough away from us that we do not really feel that we are in danger. Otherwise, the pleasure that we get from that sublime feeling would be lost. If you're standing on top of a cliff and you're worried you're going to fall down it, you're not thinking, oh, how beautiful how impressive this cliff is. You're just thinking, I want to save my life. If you're at a safe distance from that cliff's edge, you can appreciate the sublime prospect. So nature then is a common source of the sublime in that it can often produce this effect of a grandness that exceeds our limited sensory capacities. Mountains, waterfalls, cliffs are frequently cited as sublime, both because of their size and because of their danger. This emphasis on the sublime power of nature strongly influences the Romantic poets, and many of whom do explicitly invoke these categories introduced by Burke. Note during the course of this course, we will note how many of the Romantics are fascinated by mountains, particularly the Alps, which we're looking at Percy Shelley's Mont Blanc. It's also referenced in his wife Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein. Wordsworth's Prelude also has a significant scene in the Alps. So this romantic concern with the sublimity of nature is also formulated in relation to another important discourse of the time, which is the picturesque. Now, this is a term that may be more common for us today, but it was quite new for the Romantics, having been coined in the 18th century. And it's worth pausing over this term a little bit, because it's maybe a little more problematic than it might seem to us today. What does it mean to call a landscape picturesque? The very word implies that criteria originally applied to art, i.e. a picture, are now being applied to the context of nature. But this art, which is termed picturesque, originally sought to be a faithful representation of nature. So, in a way, picturesque implicitly signifies nature imitating art, imitating nature. And the category of the picturesque, as formulated by 18th century critics, is one that simultaneously claims to imitate nature and to correct it through the application of proper artistic rules. This is exemplified by the 18th century obsession with improving landscapes. The idea was to produce a landscape. Usually, if somebody owned a lot of property, they would improve it by creating a landscape that appeared thoroughly natural, even as it obeyed the laws of artistic composition. Usually that involved selecting one particular spot on your property from which the landscape should be viewed, and then cultivating the proper artistic perspective. In other words, the picturesque is a highly regulated version of nature, but it was also an attempt to mediate between the sublime and the beautiful. The picturesque sought harmony through contrasts. The idea wasn't to simply be a beautiful object like a highly cultivated garden, since such orderly lines as you might see in such a garden were seen as being quite monotonous. If you ever see flowers planted in a straight line, maybe they have a certain appeal, but the straight lines get boring after a while. On the other hand, the ideal wasn't simply to give in to wildness and sublime fearfulness either, since there was no sense of harmony in that either. There's something intimidating and awesome about that in a way that would challenge the perspective of the viewer. So the ideal was to have a landscape with broken and irregular lines that nevertheless gave some appearance of harmony. So the result then is a rather perverse attempt to produce a version of nature that looked natural, but was in fact carefully constructed. And adding to the perversity of this attempt was the 18th century fascination with ruins. Ruined castles and monasteries, on the one hand, fit in quite well with Burke's theory of the sublime. Often impressive achievements that had fallen into disrepair. They signified a massive accomplishment and the even more sublime power of time to throw every human accomplishment into decay. From the picturesque point of view, however, ruins have the added appeal of representing precisely the tension between the sublime and the beautiful that it was interested in cultivating. Pure landscape could be seen as just boring. Modern urban landscapes were certainly not artistic, but ruins are appealing because they provide a contrast of human construction and nature without negating or overpowering the natural. Ruins, in fact, became such a vogue in the 18th century that rich people would construct ruins on their property in order to enhance the view. In other words, they would construct pre-ruined buildings, fake ruins, with no purpose except this aesthetic one of creating picturesque interest. Finally, the picturesque adds one important point to the English theory of landscape, in that it places a new value on English landscape. That maybe the landscape in England is worth writing about and painting. The assumption had always been that the European continent had cornered the market on beautiful scenery and art. But with the outbreak of war between England and France in the 1790s, it became much more difficult for the English to go abroad, so there was a tendency to turn back to English landscapes and to value them for what made them distinct, and in particular, their irregularity. So this new emphasis on English landscape is another very important influence on the English Romantic poets, who were turned towards their native land as the subject for their work. So the Romantics, on the one hand, inherit much of the sensibility associated with the picturesque, but they also react against it in important ways. For example, many Romantic poets would challenge the picturesque claim to an authoritative point of view on the natural landscape. Rather, they would insist on the power of nature in itself and not just a particular point of view on it. Moreover, for the Romantics, the line between the human subject and the natural world is much more blurry than it is for proponents of the picturesque. In the picturesque, the observer always stands outside and often above nature, gaining aesthetic pleasure from apprehending it at a distance, but not actually participating in it. One of the crucial elements of the Romantic revolution against this view of nature is the idea that the observer is part of nature. The observing subject and the observed object start to blur into one another, and that's something that many Romantic poets try to come to terms with. I'd like to illustrate the distinction between the picturesque and the sublime with a few examples from the visual arts. In order to explain their ideal of the picturesque, English writers such as William Gilpin and Uvedale Price looked back to the 17th century, to painters such as Claude Lorraine and Salvatore Rosa. This painting is by Lorraine. These painters present landscapes that are usually quite active, with noticeable human inhabitants. Within the landscape, objects drawing our attention to all planes of the painting: foreground, middle ground, and background. So in this case, we have someone playing a musical instrument at the front, while another peasant is driving cows into the background, and we also have a bridge and seemingly a castle in the further background, and then rolling hills still further into the background. So there are a lot of action on a lot of planes here. That was a landscape with Apollo and Mercury. And as I said, Lorraine was upheld as exemplary of the picturesque. Also, Salvatore Rosa. Notice also in these paintings the use of irregular lines. In this painting, we have a gnarled tree trunk at the front, which embodies the picturesque idealization of disorderly composition. Rosa's landscapes were very much admired by critics of the picturesque, and also influenced novelists of the time. Anne Radcliffe's Gothic novels were frequently citing Rosa's paintings. By contrast, JMW Turner is the English artist most easily associated with the Sublime. Notice in his work that he is not satisfied with irregularity, but he cultivates outright obscurity and the feeling of danger. It's often hard to see the subjects of his works, as they are often clouded in mist, fog, and darkness, as in this example. Turner thus embodies very much what Burke means by the sublime. It's not simply these natural phenomena, such as waterfalls in the ocean, that are sublime, but it's the way in which Turner seeks to represent them. The obscurity, the sense of danger that one gets from his paintings. What makes them sublime is the impossibility of seeing them clearly and objectively. The rational faculties are unable to process and master these phenomena, and it is precisely that failure that is represented in Turner's artworks. Burke also suggests that poetry is more suited to the sublime than painting, since in painting you always see a picture, so to some extent it necessarily gives a visual representation. But then Turner comes some 100 years after Burke, so Burke never saw Turner's paintings. At any rate, this is something that we will see becoming a preoccupation of the Romantic poets: how to convey in language something that transcends language and is ultimately irreducible to representation. Many of the poets we'll look at on this course ask or try to answer this very question, and to some extent these poets follow Burke, and in some ways, as we'll see, they try to take him further by accounting for the nature of the sublime in different